Now let's take a look at the elements that constitute to a typical SQL query using DML statements. First, we usually start with a select statement. You can use a select statement to retrieve data from tables and specify certain conditions. After the select statement, you would typically specify the columns of the data that you wish to retrieve data from. Now, the from statement is then used to decide which table to retrieve your data rows from. Then you can also optionally add a where clause or where statement, which is a conditional statement that specifies which data to include and which data to exclude depending on the evaluation of the condition. If you're using some of the aggregation or summarization functions in the select statement, you can often use the group by statement to group the aggregation or summary that you're trying to do in the query. And the order by statement, which is again another optional statement that you can add, can be used to rank the results of the data that you're retrieving. Now, if we take a look at an example of a select statement, in basic English, this query or this statement is essentially saying find the employees who served customer 71 at least once and rank them by the employee number. Now in SQL, what I want to do is I want to retrieve data from the orders table in the sales database, and this is specified from the from statement. And the data I'm interested in are employee ID and the order year, which is specified in the select statement. And I'm only interested in the data where the customer ID is 71, which is specified in the where statement. I also want the results returned to be in groups of employee ID and order year. And so this is specified in the group by statement. And I only want results where there is a record return, and each of the results needs to be grouped if there are multiple records found. And so this is specified in the having statement. And then I want to rank the results first by employee ID and then by order year, which is specified after the order by statement. Now, if we take a look at an example of an insert statement, so in plain simple English, this is simply saying I want to add a new order to the orders details table. So in SQL, what we do is we insert into the order details table, which is inside the sales database, the following values. So for order ID, I want to insert 10255. Product ID, I want to insert 39. Unit price, I want to insert 18. Quantity is 2, and the discount is 0.05, which means 5%.
Now, you use DDL statements to create, modify, and remove tables and other objects in the database. So these objects could be tables, store procedures, views, and so on and so forth. Now, the most common DDL statements or data definition language statements are create, which allows you to create a new object in the database, such as a table or a view, or alter. So alter allows you to modify the structure of an object. For instance, you can alter a table by adding more columns to it. The next one is drop. So drop allows you to remove an object from a database. So if you want to drop a table, for example, if you no longer need it. And then rename is another one that you can use to rename an existing object. So if you wanted to rename a table, for example, that's where you would use the rename statement.
Now, if we look at an example of the create statement, this statement or this example creates a new database table called myTable in the database. And so the items between the brackets or the parentheses specify the details of each of the columns in the table, so including name, data type, whether the column needs to have a value or not, so that's a not null, and whether the data in the column is used to uniquely identify a row, which is the primary key part. So every table should have a primary key. Although SQL doesn't actually enforce this rule, the primary key is then used to uniquely identify each data row item in the table. Now, columns that are marked as not null are referenced to as mandatory columns, which means they need to have a value inside those particular columns. If you omit the not null clause, you can create rows that don't contain values inside that column. So that means an empty column in a row is said to have a null value. Now, the data types available for columns in the table will actually vary depending on the database management system. However, most database management systems support numeric types like int, which stands for integer, and string types like varchar, which stands for variable length, and they generally contain text kind of data. So now let's have a look at how we can provision an Azure SQL database and also query data inside an Azure SQL database. So I'm going to head over to my Azure portal to provision and query an Azure SQL database. Now that I'm on my Azure portal, this is how I'm going to provision my Azure SQL database. So this is what the home page of my Azure portal looks like. Now I am using the preview version, so your one might actually look slightly different because preview means it's still in beta mode. So to create any resource, including an Azure SQL database, I can come into my left-hand menu bar, open this up and create a resource from here. Alternatively, what I like to do is I actually like to search for the resource I'm creating. So if I look up a SQL database, for example, I get to create a Azure SQL database from here. And so I simply go add, and I'm taken to the configuration page. And I need to go through those settings that I talked through earlier, starting with the basics. So I need to choose an Azure subscription to provision this Azure SQL database to. I'm using my internal subscription. And I also need to specify the resource group which this Azure SQL database will go into. So I've actually created one, but you can also optionally create a new resource group from here. So I'm actually going to create a new resource group and call it a demo. And now I'm going to place this Azure SQL database inside a new resource group called demo. Here I need to specify the database name. So I need to give my database name. So I'm going to call this my demo database, for example. And this checks out. Now I need to create my virtual SQL server for my Azure SQL databases. So I can come into here and I can create a new Azure SQL server. I need to give it a unique SQL server name. And so this name needs to be not used by anyone before. So for example, if I use demo, this is going to be probably invalid because someone's already created a SQL server with this name. So I need to give it something unique. So I'm going to call it demo and just pass it some numbers. Now, hopefully, yes, this one, no one has used this name for a SQL server, so I can create a SQL server with this particular name. And I need to also give it some credentials to be able to log into my SQL server. And so again, we can't use names like admin. This will reject me. So I need to give a server admin login name that is relevant to my SQL server. So for example, if I say demo user, and I need to input some passwords. So make sure the password is strong enough and re-enter the password as well. Now, the location is the Azure region that we want to provision this Azure SQL database to. So currently, the default is East US, but I can come into here and I can select any one of the Azure regions around the world to provision my Azure SQL database to. I'm just going to leave the default East US one, and I'm just going to click OK. And that's gone and set up my SQL server for me. Now here I can specify if I want to use a SQL Elastic pool. So it's simply a toggle between yes or no. Because this is a demo, I'm just going to leave it as the default no. And this is where I'm going to essentially pick out the size for my Azure SQL database. So the compute and storage is essentially where I'm going to configure how much storage and compute resources that I'll need to run my Azure SQL database. So if I come into config database, I get a couple of options and tiers that I can choose from. So general purpose, hyperscale, business critical. And if we scroll down a little bit, we can see the price of selecting this particular tier. Now I'm actually going to scale my database right down because this is again a demo database, so I don't need that much resources. I'm going to select the basic one, and then I'm just going to scale that all the way down. And I can see that the estimated cost for the smallest possible Azure SQL database is going to cost me about $6.85 a month. I'm just going to hit apply. And I'm going to go to the next tab, which is a networking tab. Now with the networking connectivity, we can configure how we can connect to our Azure SQL database. Now by default, remember that all access to our Azure SQL database is blocked. I can enable public access, or I can have a private endpoint access to my Azure SQL database. So I'm going to open this up for public access. And here I can specify some of the firewall rules. So do I want to allow Azure services and resources to access the server? Probably if I want to use an Azure virtual machine to access my Azure SQL server. And do I want to add my current IP address from this device to allow access to this particular Azure SQL server? So I'm going to as well. Now if we go to additional settings, this is where you can specify the data source. And so we can create a blank, brand new database, or we can create an existing one so we can restore it from backup, or we can come in here and we can use some of the sample data that Microsoft Azure SQL Database provides to populate our new database. So I'm going to select the sample one. And the sample database is going to populate data from the AdventureWorks LT database. And down here, we can also set up Azure Defender for SQL. Now, this is that advanced threat protection, which provides the vulnerability assessment and threat protection for our SQL server. So I'm not going to enable it for now. And then we move into the tags tab. Now, in the tags tab, generally when you provision any Azure products or services, you would encounter this particular tab. Tags is where you can add metadata to your Azure resources. And the metadata we can then use to filter and find our resources once we've provisioned it. So for example, I might want to say that this particular database is a demo database. And after that, I can simply hit review and create. Now that's going to run a validation test to check that all the configuration details I provided is indeed correct. And once it checks out, I simply hit create. And now that's going to submit my deployment to Azure to go and set up that Azure SQL database for me. Now, because we are limited by time, I've actually set up an Azure SQL database already. So we can go and look at an example one that I've already set up. So if I go and look up SQL database again, I can find the one that I've set up before this training. So if I go into it, I can see on the overview page or the overview tab some of the details about this particular Azure SQL database. So for example, it's sitting in the DP900 resource group. It's subscribed to my internal subscription, and this is the SQL Server name, which is actually where the SQL database is running on. Now, if I scroll down a little bit, we see a query editor. So with the query editor, we can use this to query our Azure SQL database. So I'm going to come into my query editor. And I need to authenticate myself to be able to access this particular Azure SQL database. So if I wanted to essentially execute any queries against this particular database, I need to verify myself first. So I can choose between SQL Server Authentication, or I can use Active Directory Authentication. I'm going to pick SQL Server Authentication, and I'm just going to put in the password for this Azure SQL Database. Let me re-enter the password. And now I'm inside the query editor for this particular Azure SQL Database, which means I can use this to start executing some of those SQL queries that I want against this database. So again, like the demo one that I set up, I've actually used some of the sample data to populate this particular database. So if I open up tables, I can see some of the sample tables and data that's already populated into this particular Azure SQL database. So I can minimize some of these panels on the left here to make more room on my screen. And let's just execute a very simple SQL statement like select. Let's look at the customers table. And this very simple SQL query is just going to return all the rows from the customer table so that I can look at all the data inside the customer table. So I simply hit run. And that query took 1 second to execute. Now, if I move down a little bit, or minimize the screen a little bit, I can see some of the results that were returned from the query. And so this is all the data inside the customer data table. Now, if we look at something a little bit more interesting, I can see that there is a sales order table in my database. So let's change this to sales order. So sales order, and hit execute. Now I can see all the sales order data in the sales order detailed table. So it contains columns like sales order ID. If I scroll across, order quantity, product ID, which tells me that this is actually a foreign key which references the product ID in the products table. And so let's actually go and reference the products table from my order details table. And so if, for example, I wanted to find all the products that are inside the order details table and the products table, I can do something like an aggregation. Product P. So I need to give my tables that I'm querying from some aliases, because what I'm going to be doing is actually referencing the same column name. And so I need to have aliases to be able to tell SQL that I'm referencing the particular column. And so I'm just going to give this P, and I'm going to specify a where clause, which is that conditional statement where I can say I'm only interested in the results which will return me the product ID from the sales order table. That is the same as the product ID from the product table. Now, if I hit execute, I get a result of 542, which tells me that the total number of products that have been ordered is 542. Now, what's interesting is if I wanted to find out how many products existed, I can do a pretty similar query. So I can do select, count all the rows from the product table, and I can highlight this, which means I'm only going to be executing this particular query. So if I hit run, I find out that there are 295 products in the products table, which tells me that there have been at least one or more products that has been ordered more than once from the results that I got from my sales order detail table. Now, these are very simple queries, and you can do a lot more complicated and complex SQL queries, but this is just some of the power that you can do using Azure SQL Database. So you can use a couple of tools to query data held inside an Azure SQL Database, like the Azure portal, which we saw. You can also use the SQL command utility or the SQL CMD utility from the command line on your device or using the Azure Cloud Shell. You can also use SQL Server Management Studio or Azure Data Studio or the SQL Server data tools to query data held inside your Azure SQL database. To use these tools, you need to first establish a connection to the database. So you'll need to provide some of those credentials to be able to log in to the server and connect to it. So the admin username and password, for example. Now, SQL Server Management Studio is a tool that you can download and run on your desktop. And typically this has been used for connecting to and executing SQL queries to on-premises SQL Server databases. The SQL Server Data Tools is a tool that you can actually use inside Visual Studio to connect to your Azure SQL databases. The Azure Data Studio is a graphical utility for creating and running SQL queries from your desktop. It's much more lightweight than the SQL Management Studio, and it's a great tool for connecting to your Azure SQL databases because that's what it's kind of built for. Now, the SQL CMD or the SQL command line utility can be run from your command line, and it's also available from the Azure Cloud Shell. So you specify the parameters to identify the server that you want to connect to alongside with the credentials, and then simply after that you can start executing your SQL queries through the SQL command line as you would in any of the other tools. Now, PostgreSQL provides many tools that you can use to connect to a PostgreSQL database and run queries on. These tools include pgadmin, which is a graphical user interface tool, or you can also use the PGSQL command line utility. There are also a large number of third-party utilities that you can use as well. And so let's have a look at how we can use the pgadmin tool to connect to an Azure PostgreSQL database. So now I'm back on my Azure portal. Now I'm not going to take you through how to configure and set up the Azure PostgreSQL server on Azure because it's a very similar process to the Azure SQL database. What I'm going to show you is how to use the pgadmin tool to connect and execute queries against the Azure PostgreSQL database. So I can see that this is the Azure PostgreSQL database I've already set up. And now I'm going to switch over to my pgadmin tool to connect to my Azure PostgreSQL database and execute some queries against it. So I've actually already entered in the configuration strings and login credentials to connect to my PostgreSQL. So I can simply open it up. And now under databases, I see that I've got 4 databases. Some of these ones are already set up by PostgreSQL. I've actually went ahead and created one called My Demo Database. So if I come into here and I go right click, I can create a script, which then allows me to go and execute some SQL queries against this database. So this is just the default ones. I'm going to erase it. And this database should be completely empty. So let's go and create a table. So I'm going to execute a create table statement, and I'm going to call this table customers. Now, inside my customer table, I need to specify a couple of columns. And so let's say customer ID, which is going to be a primary key, and it's not going to be null. I'm also going to have a customer name, which is going to take a varchar, and let's give it 50 characters, and also not null. Now I simply hit this play button to execute the statement. And we see down here that the query has successfully been executed. So now I'm just going to insert some values into my newly created customer table. So let's do insert into customers the following values. In customers, I also need to define the columns that I want to insert values into. So customer ID and the customer name. And let's just say I'm going to give the ID 1 and I'll just give it my name. And if I highlight this, I'm just going to insert one record into my customer table. And so that's been successfully executed. Now if I do a select all statement from my customers table and highlight this statement and hit execute, I can see that newly created customer table with the new row of data that I've inserted into returned back to me as a result. Just as with PostgreSQL, there are many tools available to connect to your MySQL database as well. That enables you to create and run scripts containing SQL commands. So you can use the MySQL command line utility, which is also available through the Azure Cloud Shell, or you can use the graphical tools from the desktop, such as MySQL Workbench. So let's take a look at how we can use the MySQL Workbench to connect to our Azure MySQL database and execute some SQL queries through there. So again, I've already pre-provisioned a Azure MySQL server and database that's running on MySQL, and now we're going to have a look at how we can use the MySQL Workbench to both access this MySQL database that's running on Azure and execute some queries against it. So I'm on my MySQL Workbench and I've already pre-connected to my MySQL Azure database that's running on Azure. So I simply open up the connection and I need to provide the password to be able to authenticate into my Azure MySQL database. You can see the admin username and the server connection string. So now I just need to put in my password. Hit OK. And now that's going to authenticate into my Azure MySQL database. So once I'm in, I've actually predefined some queries that I was executing earlier before this training. And so I'm just going to highlight them and run through the same process, creating a table, but this time we're going to create an inventory table in our Azure MySQL database. And so I have already set up a My Demo database here. And so I'm going to use my demo database and I'm going to create an inventory table that has an ID as a column, a name and quantity. I'm just going to hit this little lightning button which will run it. And that's executed successfully. Now I'm going to insert a couple of rows, particularly these 3 rows of values into my new inventory table. So I'm going to highlight it and hit execute. And I've inserted 3 rows of data into my newly created inventory table. And then I'm just going to select all the rows from my inventory table. And I can see here all the new values that I've inserted into my table. So banana, orange, apple. And finally, this drop table statement is going to effectively delete my inventory table to remove it from the database. That's effectively been executed. So if I go and highlight this select all from inventory table again, it should throw me an error. And there you see, because the inventory table no longer exists in my demo database anymore. This concludes the first part of this virtual training. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. We covered Module 1, where we had a look at core data concepts, and Module 2, where we had a look at relational data in Azure. So thank you for your attendance and participation so far. I hope you'll join me for part 2 of this Microsoft Virtual Training Day for Data Fundamentals next time.